Okay, so today I'm introducing you to an additive method of sculpting portraits. There's a lot of ways to sculpt portraits, but we're going to focus on additive for today. The benefits of additive is that when you add each individual piece, you're thinking about it like a decision. You can think of the additive method is like the light-handed pencil of drawing. No, it's a sketch. So you can easily add it, or if you change your mind, you can easily take it away. The first thing that we have to focus on is establishing the profile or the center line of the portrait. The main thing that we want to do is to focus on creating the profile, but also the big masses. So we can right away in the blocking begin to add in the mass on the widest point of the skull, just here towards the back. And the other areas where we'll begin to add pretty rapidly are in the zygomates and the jaw. The way that I'm approaching this particular way of sculpting is an additive method, so I want to keep everything underbuilt. This is the first stage of creating a portrait in sculpture. We want to begin in focusing on the big masses and mainly focusing on the profile of the figure. Typically when I'm working on a portrait sculpture, I will focus on the measurement of from beneath the nose to the hairline. It's a useful point of reference because it is on a part of the skull that's not going to change. No? If we take a measurement from the top of the forehead to the bottom of the jaw, this can change depending on if your model is relaxed or more tense. No? Because sometimes people will relax with their jaw open. No? Their lips are closed, but their teeth are separated, and this affects the overall length of the face. The two main measurements that I focus on in the portrait is this measurement from the top of the forehead to the bottom of the nose and the width of the zygomates. This establishes an overall proportion in height and width. So normally when you're working with a model, I recommend that you always make notes of the measurements that you have taken so that you are not repeatedly taking measurements directly from the model. So you can take the measurement that you have adjusted on your calipers and make a note on a paper or a piece of wood. So as you can see at the moment, my profile line has become a little bit off-center, and this is why we also want to keep redrawing the center line, because as we work from the profile perspective, we want to know the location where that center line should be. Now that I have the profile line more or less established, I'm going to begin adding the basic widths from the front perspective. These widths will focus on the zygomate and the jaw. I want to avoid adding any mass of the width to the features until the overall big masses have been established. The same way how in drawing we want to think in the big shapes first before working on the details, the same thing applies here in sculpture. If you can turn this way for a moment. Okay, we're going to continue focusing on the profile as I want to make some adjustments, and the main thing When I'm working on this additive portrait, I want to focus on establishing a really solid profile, because this is going to be my point of reference for the entire portrait. So I'm going to continue now by focusing on some of the major widths. And I'll begin by adding the box of the forehead, the zygomates, and the jaw. Okay, when I begin sculpting a portrait, I usually start by using a stick, actually, just to knock the clay onto the armature quickly. And then as I continue the portrait, essentially working with bigger tools, larger tools first, and getting to the smaller tools, the more detailed I get. The large flat surface helps me to unify the form as I'm creating it. When I start on the widths, I focus on the box of the forehead, the zygomate, and the jaw, because they are parts of the bony structure of the skull. So if we take a look at the skull, here we can see clearly the box of the forehead, the zygomate, and the jaw. And essentially, when we're trying to capture the likeness of someone, we can capture that best if we establish their proportions accurately. So to capture someone's likeness, it's not so much about the details as it is about capturing an accurate proportion. The blocking stage, which we are doing today, is probably the most important stage of the portrait process, because if we establish the correct proportions, this establishes the base of our likeness. If we want to push that further in the details, we can focus on the individual person and their expression. But for today, we focus just in the big proportions. At this point, I can double check my big proportions to see if they're actually accurate. So I'm going to take a measurement of the zygomates. Nice. Can use the spatula to draw on the surface of the clay to begin blocking in the locations of where some of the details will go. So I look for the hairline, the location of the ear, the jaw. Something that people struggle with in portraits is they get hung up in the details and they focus on the features rather quickly, so they create a general head, because it's very easy to create a general shape of a head, but the difficulty lies in capturing the likeness of a person, and that is usually established first in the proportions, and in the profile. So if you can get those two things, you're well on your way to creating a solid likeness. I'm going to have you turn towards me for a moment. Okay, at this stage in the sculpture, as I'm still trying to create the overall proportions, I'm going to put some placeholders for the ears. I'm not committing to these ears, they will be adjusted later, but it's just so that when I stand back, I have a bigger impression of the big shapes, a better impression of the big shapes. Now that I have the big masses in place, I can begin adding some form around the lips and the nose. When I begin adding mass to the lips and the nose, I'm still always thinking in big form, big masses before smaller shapes. After I have established the block and I can get into developing the details themselves. When I'm sculpting the lips, the thing that I'm thinking about is the curvature of the teeth, actually. If you look at the skull from below, you can see how curved the teeth are. They curve far back in space, and you have to think that the lips are wrapping around those teeth. A common problem in portraiture is that the lips will become too flat. Or in general, the portrait will become too flat, and you have to think of the curve on the face. Otherwise, as I'm adding masses, I usually think back to the first exercises of the David features. No? Everyone has different features, but there are specific designs within those features that you can find typically in most people. So, for example, when I'm looking at the lips, I'm typically looking for these round forms. You find usually 1 or 2 round forms in the lower lips and 3 to 5 round forms in the upper lip. The other area that I focus on is the corners of the mouth, trying to create this shadow or the funnel shape. In the nose, I'll typically add the width of the nose and worry about the detail around the flaps of the nostrils later. Normally, when I sculpt the eyes, I add a mass within the eye sockets first, and then I will observe from the profile perspective. So, Louis, if you can turn that way. And instead of focusing on the eyes themselves, my primary focus is on the eyelids. When you're sculpting a portrait, there's a specific set of priorities that you have to think of. No? You have to focus first in the heights, then in the width, and then in the depth. So we established first the heights when we were creating the line of the profile. Now we have also established the widths, the overall large widths. No? And the next step, we need to double check the depths. We cannot check with a measurement the depths until both the heights and the widths have been established. Louis, I'm going to take a measurement from under the nose to your ear. I'm going to make an example so that you can see what I mean about this relationship though. If we add some extra mass here and we take the same measurement, this is the same depth measurement. If we have the widths too wide, then when we take a measurement in the depths, that measurement will appear closer to the profile. And the opposite is true, that if your widths are not fully established, if they are too narrow, then when you take a depth measurement, it will be too long. When you're blocking in the hair, you still want to be thinking in big shapes. Now, when you're working on a portrait, typically you'll have several model sessions and the hair will always be changing. What you want to establish is a big overall shape. When you're working on a portrait, you can work on both sides simultaneously when you're beginning to add the information. However, if you are trying to capture a likeness, sometimes it can be helpful in order to establish the most accurate blocking. It can be helpful to block in one side first, and then blocking the next side separately so that you have more time to observe. And this way, then after you have completed both sides, you can check to see if they're lining up. When you're working with a model and you're using your calipers, you always want to communicate and make sure you ask for permission before doing so. You also want to make sure you adjust the tool away from the model before approaching. When you're taking a measurement of the width, you want to avoid approaching directly from the front, as we don't want anyone's eyes to get poked. You do want to take measurements of the eyes when you're sculpting a portrait just to make sure that they are lining up correctly. However, sometimes it is better option just to give the calipers to the model directly. Can you take a measurement from the corners of your eyes? Okay. Nice. Cool. Thank you. Another useful measurement to take, and this is not a direct measurement, but you want to take also the measurement of the distance between the pupils. And to do this, you just want to line up the calipers below the eyes in line with the pupils. It's useful to continually draw in the center line, as this will help us to avoid adjusting the profile line as we're working on the front or three-quarter views. In portrait sculpting, we often want to look from below to check the depths. This can also help us to see if the features are lining up in a symmetrical way. This is something that we can't see when we're looking only from the front or only from the side. This tool is probably one of my favorite tools for sculpting portraits, especially when you get into the details, as it has the thumb end, like your typical thumb sculpting tools. However, it also has this knobbed end, which is quite useful for getting into the details around the eyes, the lips, and the nose. Before I carve out the nose, I mostly just look at the line following from the bowl of the nose into the wing of the nose. Establish these angle changes first. Another benefit to working each profile separately is that it assists you in noticing the details of the asymmetry between the difference between each side of the face. We often think of the face as a symmetrical form, but there's a lot of small details that are a little bit off, and this creates an asymmetry that helps us to identify each other. When you work in an additive method, this stage always looks like an extra old version of yourself.
Yeah, true.
It's funny. Is that typical?
For the block-in in an additive method, yes, it is typical that at this stage, because of like all the little wrinkles and everything, and it's usually quite blocky, no? There's a lot of sharp angles. It gives this appearance of like an elderly individual for some reason. When you finish your block-in stages, you'll want to take some notes at the end of that day so that when you come back to the next model session, you'll be able to jump right into the things that you weren't sure about before. So if there are areas where you think mass might need to be taken away, you can create some little notes to remove, or if there's something where you think there definitely needs to be added a mass, you can add a knob of clay to indicate that you're looking to add mass in that area. For today, we've completed the block-in stages. So we have focused first on the profile, we established the major widths and the big proportions. If we wanted to complete this portrait, we would have to continue into the details, make sure that we make some design choices about how we want to describe hair or the color of the eyes. Sculpting a portrait can take anywhere from 4 to maybe 36 hours, depending on what is the intentions and the time that you have with a model, if you're working from photo references. If you're interested in learning how to complete a portrait or sculpt a figure, we'll look forward to seeing you in our workshops here at the Academy of Fine Art Germany. Normally, when you're working on a portrait, you have... No. Okay. Normally, when I'm... Thank you. Okay. I don't know why I can't do this. Okay.